Well, good afternoon and welcome to you all of you here in the full house of the Carlucci Auditorium, all of you in the overflow space, and not last but not least, all of you who are joining us online. My name is George Moose, and I have the both honor and pleasure of serving as the acting president of the United States Institute of Peace. And we are deeply honored to serve as the co-host for PeaceCon's opening day with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, which I think can rightly claim to be the world's largest and most important network of peacebuilders. The partnership between USIP and AFP is, I would argue, critical to elevating the presence of and the dialogue among peacebuilders, and to charting a way forward for the future of our community. And so we're delighted simply by the sheer number of peacebuilders joining us here today, which I think is a testament to the importance of these conversations. As most of you, certainly in this gathering, will know, USIP was established by an act of the US Congress in 1984 as a national, nonpartisan public institution dedicated to helping prevent, de-escalate, and resolve violent conflicts overseas, and to building peace in their aftermath. So this marks the Institute's 40th anniversary, and I've had the pleasure of serving on the board of the Institute for 16 of those 40 years. But the Institute's story goes well back beyond 1984. Indeed, it goes all the way back to the country's first president, George Washington, and the vision he had even then of a national peace university. And indeed, Washington envisioned that this very piece of land on which the USIP headquarters now stands would be the location for his National Peace Academy. So you see how history has a way of coming around. The idea was a recurring theme throughout our history, but it gained momentum in the 1960s and 70s, in part because of the Vietnam War. It found strong support among prominent members of the US Congress, notably among veterans of World War II and the Korean War, serving as they did and wanting to find smarter ways for the United States to deal with conflict around the world. And it was given impetus by a grassroots movement from across the country, something I know well from my days going to school in Iowa and having experienced something called the Iowa Peace Institute, which was part of that movement. And those who drafted the USIP Act in 1984, and I would commend it to you as a prescient document about our field. Those who drafted it did so with the firm conviction that while peaceful conflict is inevitable, violent conflict is not. They set out to build both a constituency for that belief, as well as a community of practitioners who would be equipped to realize it. Thus, from its inception, a core element of USIP's mission has been to educate and train peacebuilders worldwide with effective tools and approaches to prevent, manage, and resolve violent conflicts. And for the past 40 years, USIP has worked to seed and build the field of peacebuilding through its public education and training efforts. In that time, the Institute has awarded over 2,300 grants to organizations across the US and in over 90 countries around the world to enable them to contribute to the body of knowledge on peacebuilding and conflict resolution. USIP has also worked to integrate peacebuilding into public education curriculums across the US through its Peace Teachers program, which has provided professional development and curriculum support to scores of teachers around the country. USIP also counts some 180 professors from 118 institutions of higher learning in 35 states and 12 countries among its peace professors, a community of practice that works to develop the next generation of peace builders and to advance scholarship in the peace building field. And it has also awarded over 400 peace scholarships for PhD students finishing their dissertations on topics related to conflict resolution, and over 500 grants to universities of higher education in the United States and overseas to develop peacebuilding research and on-the-ground practitioner projects in conflict zones around the world. And finally, through the Gandhi King Global Academy, USIP provides free and publicly available professional development training and conflict resolution tools, starting with the principle of proper conflict analysis. Now, looking at the community that is assembled here today, I have no doubt that the Institute's founders would be proud and gratified to see the fruits of their vision and the community that has been built around it. For the past 12 years, PeaceCon has convened the peacebuilding field annually, from the grassroots to the top levels of government, to put peace at the forefront of our agenda and to reflect on the state of the world and to find a way forward by continuous learning and improving of our practices. Today's conference is contextualized by a world experiencing a full-scale war in the heart of Europe, a deepening conflict in the Middle East, and growing threats to peace and security around the world. We are seeing an alarming evolution in the drivers of conflict, including declines in social cohesion, weak social contracts, and increased vulnerabilities to climate and other shocks. And compounding these trends is the emergence of new technologies and other disruptors, as well as new state and non-state actors posing new challenges and new complexities and new opportunities. In short, the landscape of conflict and peacebuilding has never been more complex. Where we face an arduous challenge, we also see a plethora of opportunity. The case for global peace and conflict prevention is as urgent and as compelling today as it has ever been. But during this conference, we will be called upon to ask ourselves if our current approaches and strategies and practices are sufficient to meeting current needs and current challenges. We need to consider whether our peacebuilding toolbox is still fit for purpose. Are there demands and expectations that are not currently being met? And if so, what tools, techniques, approaches, and practices do we need to develop to meet them? I am truly inspired to be here today in a room full of peace builders who want to make the world a better place. And I know that you bring that commitment and dedication to the conversations in which you will be engaging over the next 3 days as we consider how to strengthen the impact of the peacebuilding field. And now I have the pleasure of inviting to the floor Alan Fitz, the chair of the board and executive committee member at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this year's PeaceCon Status Quo No More. Before I begin, though, I do want to thank the whole team at AFP for the tremendous work that got us here today. We're looking at 3 days, over 65 sessions, hundreds of speakers. It's a huge lift and a huge amount of effort that goes into pulling off an event like this. So I just want to thank them up front for the tremendous efforts that got us to this point today. My name is Alan Fitz. I have the honor of serving as the chairman of the Alliance for Peacebuilding Board of Directors. In addition to working with AFP, I'm the vice president for strategy and operations at American Express, where I help oversee our communication strategy, corporate policy, and also our corporate philanthropy through the American Express Foundation. And while I do have some background in peacebuilding, I had a past career in government, having worked at both the White House and the State Department during the Obama administration. You may be asking yourself, what sense does it make for someone from the financial services sector to be welcoming you here today? It's a fair question, and in fact, I get this question from my peers in the corporate world often. What does peacebuilding have to do with us? But my answer is always the same. Peacebuilding is everybody's business, and especially the private sector, and especially now more than ever. Over the next several days, we'll be diving into this relationship in further detail, but it's clear that we're at a critical juncture globally. Violent conflict is increasing around the world, And while the who, what, where, when, and why of conflict is ever evolving, the impact, the devastating effects of violence, social fragmentation, and disenfranchisement of vulnerable people is universal. Conflict impacts elections, it impacts sustainable development, it impacts our health, it impacts communities and individuals alike, and for companies, it impacts the bottom line. So let's be clear, the lifeblood of the private sector is economic growth. But economic growth relies on a host of factors that are fundamental aims of the peace-building field: stability, rule of law, social cohesion. Unstable environments can disrupt operations, supply chains, and market access. Conflict leads to unpredictability. Unpredictable business conditions increases risks and raises costs. By supporting peace-building initiatives, companies have the opportunity to contribute to a more stable business climate, which in turn promotes long-term profitability. Additionally, when communities are not embroiled with managing conflict, they're enabled to allocate resources towards things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and this helps businesses too. And in today's business environment, where companies are feeling the pressure from a variety of stakeholders to do the right thing and be good corporate citizens, engaging in these efforts is an opportunity to not only enhance their reputation, but fundamentally protect themselves, the communities they care about, all while building a more resilient operating environment. It's a win-win that I think is often overlooked by this field, and one that I hope to allocate significant time and effort to advancing. I'm excited by the prospect of being here and engaging with you all on these important issues. I'm excited to help spread this message that peace building is everyone's issue, and we need all facets of community to join hands, work together to make progress. Over the next 3 days, I hope you all take the opportunity to listen and learn from the many facilitated discussions and panels we have planned, network with each other, meet your peers, connect, and perhaps find ways to collaborate in the future, and ask some tough questions, both of yourselves and of the organizations you represent, and also of each other. Building peace is a long, hard, and treacherous journey, and we need each other to achieve it. You'll see me again tomorrow. I'm going to put in a plug for my session tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. When I welcome Kirsty Graham, the CEO of Edelman, who'll be presenting the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's going to be a fantastic presentation and discussion around factors and players that bring communities together and also those that divide us. And now, thank you again for being here. I hope you enjoy the next few days at PeaceCon, and it's my pleasure to introduce Liz Hume, the Executive Director of Alliance for Peacebuilding.
Thank you so much for coming today. And I'm always still overwhelmed by the fact that we're here in person. But I also do want to acknowledge everyone that is online, that's from around the globe, here at PeaceCon. This is the 12th annual PeaceCon. And last year, it's not 40 years like USIP, but AFP's been around a little more than 20 years. And last year, we got a group of those leaders, those founders of PeaceCon, and we did a podcast. And one of their memories was that it started with 20 people. They came together. It was kind of a bit of a retreat. They came together to talk about, are we in a field? How do we advance this field? What do we do? So I want us to stop and think, like, look how far we've come, right? That was 20 years ago. And we have to work together collectively, and that is what AFP is about. But first, I want to say how thankful we are for this incredible partnership with USIP. We couldn't do this without you. The brain trust, the partnership, and I really want to mention Corinne Graff, a friend, a partner. We're so thankful. I also want to profusely thank the AFP team. Everyone always says to me, "You're really only that big?" We're not a big team. This past summer, like many of you, I got COVID, and I really struggled. It was pretty humbling how awful I felt. And this team repeatedly would say to me, "Liz, we've got this, we've got you, go rest." So I will be forever grateful to them for their humor, their support, and their dedication and hard work. So please thank them when you see them. But most importantly, again, AFP belongs to you. It's your organization. And we are so much stronger collectively. So if you are not a member, join. We can only do this together. So I'll start off and talk a little bit. So PeaceCon, we go back and forth, we debate, what should we do? And we talk about this before, months before. So we don't know what's going to happen. Well, when we were talking with our incredible board and our USIP colleagues, really the theme around what my dear friend Heba Cassis likes to talk about from Principles for Peace, our fed-upness. Really our fed-upness. And what does that mean? Well, we're hitting 2018, we hit record-breaking global violent conflict. We all know that. Social cohesion declining rapidly. And we do have leaders that talk about conflict prevention and peace building. The UN Secretary General says prevention is not a novel concept, and that the UN's founders asked the organization to focus on prevention, and that is the international community needs to invest more in prevention. President Biden, when he was putting out the global fragility strategy plans, said, these plans represent a commitment to global peace and security with the United States working alongside an array of local partners towards shared long-term goals of conflict prevention and peace building. Sometimes it's hard, right? There are these prevention promises. We don't see peace building as a priority, conflict prevention resourced. And we have to do better. We have to hold these leaders accountable. But as the peace-building field, we have to also look inside ourselves and ask us, what do we need to change? So that's where the status quo no more comes into play. How do we stop using ineffective status quo problem-solving skills, tools, narratives? Because we have to change social behavior, these norms around peace building and conflict prevention. So it's hard. It's really, really hard because our brains are not designed to do this. Mary Fitzduff, who is a longtime champion in this field, she lives in Ireland, Northern Ireland now. She wrote an incredible book, Our Brains at War. She always says, we have the ability to understand that our brains are not designed for this long-term planning. We're short-termism. We want our dopamine hit. But we have to stop and say, we have to radically change the way we think and work. And we can do this. We have the ability to change, to notice it, and to change radically the way we think. So, but with everything happening today, it is so hard sometimes. It's really easy to be cynical, throw in the white towel, say, what am I doing? I need to change careers. And I know many of you talked to me about this. One day last spring, I was having a particularly worn out week. You can name your reason. We all know the conflict stats. We all know what's happening in the world. And Ambassador McGale showed up at AFP. And we were sitting having coffee, chatting. And he was so excited about this talk that just happened at Loyola University. This incredible, the former president of Ireland was there, and the students were they couldn't stop talking about it. And Liz, you got to read these essays. I was a bit skeptical. I don't know if you know this. I was trying to humor you, and I was like, He kept shoving them at me, and I was like, oh, finally, all right, I'm going to read these essays. My jaw dropped. I kept reading them. I was like, wait. And I was saying, what these students were saying out loud. I was grabbing your hands. It was breathtaking. I had tears in my eyes because these students, on this day when I was feeling worn out, and a bit cynical, these students so eloquently reminded me why we work on these issues, that it's possible to grow up in a society that is torn apart by violent conflict and grow up to become and be known as the trust-building, bridge-building president. And that's what we have to remember, and it's hard at times, I know. So if you see Miguel and he's pushing some papers in front of you, read them, because I think about if I hadn't done that day, I wouldn't have said, oh my gosh, we need this person to come and speak at PeaceCon. So now I have the pleasure of welcoming Ambassador Dr. Miguel Diaz. He's a treasured AFP board member. You're currently the John Courtney Murray University Chair at Public Service at Loyola University. You previously served under President Barack Obama as the 9th U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. You are a prolific author, systems thinker, and I encourage everyone to check out his full bio and read whatever he's pushing in front of your face. It's life-changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I want to begin by thanking everyone who's joining us in person, in the overflow room, and digitally. And I can assure you that we are all here for a great treat this morning. I'm not going to spend time offering a detailed description and CV of President Mary McAleese so that we can spend the time we have together engaging her in conversation. I strongly encourage all of you to read her story, A Memoir of Family War, Peace and Politics, Mary McAleese's book. And I can guarantee you that after you hear her this morning, you will be motivated to do so. I invited Mary to come to Loyola University Chicago this past spring semester. We held a public event in which Dr. Hilla Hocker, one of my colleagues at Loyola, and I moderated a conversation with her. And I can assure you, Mary hit a home run. Let me share with you 5 quotes from students at Loyola that capture the profound impact Mary left on them and all those who attended this event in Chicago. From student number 1. President Mary McAleese's speech was a different type of political event. The compassion, the openness in the air proved to be different than what I was expecting. This discussion opened my eyes to the effects of a strong public leader who uses grace and soft strength rather than volume and hard-headedness, end of quote. From student number 2. It is easier to teach and preach hatred than love, for hate is a taught phenomenon. Bias is learned. But it is up to us to break this vicious cycle of blind ignorance. Mary McAleese put it beautifully by saying that we, quote, cannot give up on love among our divisions, and that as a human family, we must do better, end of quote. Student number 3. Mary's words stuck me. They struck me strongly. In fact, I immediately texted my sister to tell her about Mary and her discussion. My oldest sister is a woman 10 years older than me and has recently come out as queer to our family. My sister is the sibling with the absolute most Irish pride. I felt so connected to Mary, as though I could speak to her personally. I have a feeling that she has the ability to make everyone around her feel like this, given that she was able to make a 21-year-old from Ohio feel this way. End of quote. Student number 4. The very first takeaway I had from Mary McAleese event is that I was inspired and filled with hope for my future simply by having the opportunity to hear from a woman in a position of governmental authority. Growing up, I had only ever seen and heard of men having these positions. And it was very empowering to not only see that women can have successful careers in the political world, but also be able to hear and listen to a woman of great intelligence in this field. It was made very clear to me the importance and the role that she played in the Good Friday Agreement. End of quote. And then finally, her powerful example of building bridges means so much. In a time when tensions are high almost everywhere around the world. It would be beneficial if more leaders around the world used President McAleese as an example of how to engage in peace talks with others. Her knowledge on this subject is simply incredible. And I am sure anyone who would listen to her, as we did, for only a brief period of time, would begin to understand how to create and maintain more relationships of peace and kindness, end of quote. All undergraduate students. I have no doubt that, like the impact that Mary left on the minds and hearts of our students at Loyola University of Chicago, Mary's words this morning will prompt each of us to embrace our better angels and consider the immeasurable treasure available to us when we join forces to reject the status quo and become agents of peace and reconciliation. Please join me in warmly welcoming this amazing global human rights leader, bridge builder, and someone that I am so honored to call my dear friend, President Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland.
Gosh, no pressure then. Hi, everybody. How are you?
Very well.
No pressure. Good to see you all. Can I thank you also for asking me? Yeah, a big thank you to the Institute of Peace and indeed to the Alliance of Peacebuilders. It's great to be in the company of people that you know you're going to agree with. Doesn't always happen. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So let's begin. Can you begin by sharing with us a little about your experiences growing up in Northern Ireland and how those experiences shaped and impacted your desire to become a bridge builder?
Well, I'm from Belfast. Anybody here ever visited Belfast? Oh, wow, a lot of people. Excellent. Yes, I'm delighted to see so many peace builders have been to my native city. I was born in a place. Anybody been to Ardoyne in Belfast? A couple, three, quite a few actually have been to Ardoyne. Ardoyne is a parish, a small suburb of Belfast with the highest incidence of sectarian murders carried out during the Troubles. That's where I was born and raised. My parents were, I'm the oldest of 9 children and one of 60 children my mother and her siblings between them produced, because they thought they had to increase, multiply and fill the earth all by themselves. And they tried very hard. And we all lived kind of in a circle around each other. My parents were country people. They weren't native, they weren't urban people. They belonged to the pre-war generation, which did not have access to second level and third level education. And so they left school at 14 and 15, respectively. My father at 14, my mother at 15. And my father was a waiter, a bar attendant. My mother was a hairdresser. And so I come from a working class background. Over time, they kind of forged their way into the lower middle class somehow. But the fact that they were country people actually caused me to have a slightly different life, and perhaps was a very important part of why I became a peace builder, because Belfast, a very sectarian city, very divided city, very binary, divided along Protestant Catholic lines. Any of you who've been there at certain times of the year will know the pavements are painted just to mark the territory. You know, the red, white and blue tells you that you're in a place that probably is not going to welcome Catholics, to put it mildly. But my parents, being ignorant of all that, my father was from the west of Ireland, from the other side of Ireland, which was partitioned off from the north. So their first home that they bought we were the only Catholics on the street. So this was my first, as I was growing up, my introduction to that binary world that we managed somehow to be a spur that was not normative. But all my friends growing up then, my childhood friends, of course, whom I did not share schooling with, we all went to separate schools, ended up in separate workplaces initially. But my friends were Protestants. And that was the greatest gift I could have been given, because we have been friends for life. And through them and with them, I, first of all, began to understand the nature of Protestantism in Northern Ireland. The fact that all the Catholics we all went to the one church on the Sunday. My Protestant friends, if they bothered to go to church, they scattered in about 10 different directions. And that was an interesting phenomenon in itself. The friendships that we grew there, as I are still friends to this day, thank goodness, very important to me when I became president. But most importantly, in the mid-1960s, the instability that was part and parcel of Northern Ireland. Many of you know the story. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It was as a result of partition in the early 1920s. Ireland, which had never been partitioned, was divided into 2 parts. One is now the Republic that I am the president of, with a capital in Dublin. And when I ran for election in that republic, I had no vote because I lived in Northern Ireland. And none of my 60 cousins had votes either, which was a great pity. But anyway, I managed to win the election without them anyway, so that was okay. Because I was a citizen of Ireland, I was entitled to stand for the presidency and did. But I had grown up, I was a teenager through the 60s. Don't do the maths, but I was born shortly after the Second World War. And luckily I was born in that period, immediately the Second World War, post-war period, because the British government introduced free second-level education. And I became part of the generation described memorably by the great Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney as having intelligences brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. And we got into good schools, second-level schools, and we were taught by nuns, who, as my mother said, beat the education into us. And then we got into university, and we entered the professions in a country where Catholics had to form a civil rights movement in order to get the vote. in order to get access to housing, in order to get access to jobs. Why? Because it was a Protestant state deliberately created for a Protestant people. And so we were the minority, we were 1/3 of the population. The Protestant population was 2/3. We did not agree with partition, so we were Irish nationalists in a place dominated by British nationalists. So a recipe for conflict. That conflict eventually there had always been instability. There had been a long-standing culture of paramilitarism. And so when I see the word peace written, and one of the messages I want to leave here very strongly today, peace is the future of the human race, if the human race is to have a future. It has never been the past. Peace has never been the past, ironically. Conflict has marked human history for as long as we have been marking human history, regrettably. I mean, there is some vague evidence that way back in the days pre-AD in Ireland that there were farmers who didn't fight with each other. I'd love to have lived then. But the truth of the matter is that peace is the future that we are trying to create because it is the culmination and the fulfillment of human dignity. And what we have experienced, I born a Catholic, my next door neighbour born a Protestant, the minute we were born, we children were conscripts. We were conscripts into world views in which history was a set piece, the past was a given. We didn't share the same view of the past because by the time we were born, that history had already been edited and told to flatter one side, which was not my side. My side had another version of history that flattered its view. So suddenly, the neighbours that I lived with and played with, unknown to us little children as we were growing up, we were growing up in a time and in a place where we were being recruited to hate one another. And it's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. The toxin of hatred is so easily spread. And it was the past. So the past, for those who are peace builders, what we are trying to do is to radically interrupt that past so that the spores of hatred from that past that are carried through the lives of children, hatred is taught, history is taught, versions are taught, vanities are taught, entitlement is taught. All of that is taught and caught by the little mind, often handed on by loving parents, good people, trying to do their best, thinking they're doing the right thing, but in fact, recruiting a child to be not a good neighbour, not someone with whom you can build a peaceful future. And so I grew up, war broke out in the 1960s. I came back one night from the night that I knew I was getting into university. The first of my family to go there, and my parents, of course, thrilled. And our parish priest invited myself and another girl who were a parishioner also. We both got into university, and he invited us out for dinner. And we came back into the parish that night. And I was going to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a lawyer. And at the top of the road where we were to go left for my house and for the other girl who was with me for her house. The monastery was to the right. Our houses were to the left. We saw my friend's father on the street with a hurl. Anybody know the game of hurling, which is an Irish game? It's kind of like hockey for maniacs. And, it's a big lump of a stick, unpolished. And you can use both sides of it and you wield it in the air. It's not like hockey where you can't lift the hockey stick above your shoulder. Really. So anyway, not a game for hurlers. And anyway, these guys were at the top of the road with hurls, and they were firing old-fashioned glass marbles at the wall of the monastery to simulate the sound of bullets, in the hope of repelling forces in uniform of the state which were guiding paramilitaries to the Catholic houses and pointing out which ones were to be burnt. So that was the beginning of what we call the Troubles in my part of the world. I thought it would last a week. How naive. I was 18. I knew nothing. I thought it would last a month. I thought it would last a year. It lasted 30 years. So believe me, I know how difficult peace building is. But I also know from over those 30 years that there is actually lodged in all of us as human beings a deep yearning for peace. Because conflict's not a nice place to live in. It's horrible, waking up. If you get asleep at all. I mean, I went to bed at night worried that my father would be murdered. There were several attempts to kill him. And then the last attempt was a bomb that was left outside his pub. And a young woman, friend of mine, or her brother was one of my friends, mother of 3 children, was killed in that explosion. My father had left from home that morning. He was a gregarious man, anybody who works in a pub, he was a pub guy. And gregarious man with 9 kids, which is probably why he spent so much time in the pub. And he went out that morning happy, happy dad. The young woman was killed by the car bomb that had been left by loyalist Protestant paramilitaries. The keys of the car, when the car bomb exploded, broke her neck, and she died on the street. He ran to grab her thinking that she had just fainted, and then had to be told that in fact she had died. So when he came back home that evening, he suffered then for the next few years from a thing that we discovered then was called catatonic depression, trauma, I suppose you would call it. And so we lost our business, we lost our father's mind, and then the same Protestant paramilitaries took 2 machine guns and emptied them through the windows of our home, and so we lost our home. So that was my everyday experience. You were waking up every day, somebody belonging to you was dead, somebody in the parish was dead, tit for tat. The IRA, the Catholic version of the Protestant paramilitaries, whatever the Protestant paramilitaries did, the Catholics did the next day, only worse. And then whatever they did, the Protestants did the next day, only worse. And living through that, I realized this is stupid. This is just stupid. And the stupidity of it, and the maleness of it, and the patriarchalness of it offended me greatly. Because I could see this is going nowhere. We are going round in circles. Every time you kill somebody on my side, I kill somebody back on your side. And John Hume always quoted that great quote that an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. And we were lucky that we had a leader like John Hume, who back in the 1960s, early 1960s, had analysed the cause of the ongoing instability that led to the outbreak of the Troubles, the unfairness, the injustices, the poor relationships between the fact that the government in England, in Westminster, ignored what was going on, didn't intervene properly, and when they did intervened clumsily. All of that. He had all of that brilliantly analysed, and for 30 years he nagged us until eventually his analysis became the seed corn of the Good Friday Agreement. So that was my hinterland. The realization of quickly realizing you can let the genie of violence out of a bottle and you will pay a dear price for it. And you will also spend years trying to get that genie back in the bottle, back to this thing we call peace. And that's when I realized that peace actually was something we'd never had. That there was always the instability, there was always the paramilitarism, there was always the patriarchalism, there was always the leitmotif of violence as the best way to solve problems. And that's what we have to shift. Peace is the future. It is the ambition for the best of human nature. So I decided, that's why I wanted to be a lawyer. I realized the laws of a Protestant state for a Protestant people were never going to work for peace. They were always going to work for instability. And so I think from I was a teenager, I committed to peace. Wherever there were peace-building initiatives, I would be involved in it in some way or another. And in particular, peace-building initiatives that crossed the Protestant-Catholic divide, because there is a tendency, regrettably, to ignore religion as a factor, to say, oh, it's all politics. Actually, there was a great expression by former Irish minister, a man called Conor Cruise O'Brien, who once said memorably that if religion was a red herring, it was a red herring the size of a great white whale. And I still believe that to be true, that we do need to take the issue of religion and the impact of religion, the cultural embeddedness of attitudes, perceptions, laws, that come from very, very strong religious traditions. And indeed, like 5 out of 7 people in the world are connected to one of those strong religious traditions. The impact of those for things that are malignant as well as things that are benign. I mean, I got my Catholic education. I became the lawyer. I became the president thanks to a half-decent religious upbringing. But there was a price to be paid. There was a dark side. And it's the analysis and the critique of that I think is absolutely essential. And in particular, I would commend peace builders to always be in dialogue with the religious, because I think we ignore them at our peril. I'll just finish off with, because I've taken a long time to answer one question. My husband says I do that all the time. He should know, he's married to me nearly 50 years now. But Madeleine Albright, in her memoir, just said that when she went into the State Department, and she got these briefs, these massive briefs from analyses of expert analysis. She got one on Iran, it was about 1.5 feet thick of analysis. And then out of the wide blue yonder, it didn't mention religion. Out of the wide blue yonder, the religious revolution happened in Iran, and everybody went, what the hell happened there? Where did that come from? Missed, completely missed. So don't miss the layers that are the subterranean text of what is going on, impacting people's thoughts and minds, homophobia, attitudes to women, it's all in there. And the important thing for me was the realization, holy God, I'm in the first generation that got the chance for an education. It's so much easier in the past to have infiltrated the minds of people who didn't have access to education. But we're a generation, we are the intelligence as brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. And we have to use our intelligences as the crowbars to get rid of all the obstacles that get in the way of peace. Peace of mind, peace of heart, peace in the home, peace in the community. And we know that there is a lack of peace in our world, but also a lack of peace that starts very often in the home, in the workplace, on the internet, wherever 2 or more are gathered, and being nasty and mean and hate-filled. We who are the peacemakers have to stand our ground and be the voices of contradiction. And we can be. I mean, I think that's my thinking on peace. Peace is, it's never. Any of you know the story of St. Columbanus, the great Irish saint of the 6th century, and he inherited the post-Roman Empire, the fragmentation of the everywhere in Europe was a complete disaster, utter disaster. Everybody fighting with everybody. But Ireland, funnily enough, at that time was a peaceful place, a very peaceful place. The scholars came to Ireland with the books that were being burnt in Europe, and it was in Ireland that they were kept and they were copied. And not just Christian texts, Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles, all carefully respected and then brought back to a fragmented Europe by a man who said, he used that expression, totius Europae, and he said, look, stop fighting among yourselves. The French and the Irish can be French and Irish. You can be British, you can be German, you can be anything. But if you continue to use those labels as mechanisms for hating one another and fighting one another, you'll just go around never-ending circles. You'll never be prosperous. That peace and prosperity go hand in hand, and what drives them is partnership. And partnership relies on respect, a sense of the sacredness of the other human being, no matter what colour, what gender, what politics, respect. And that is at the heart, I think, of peacemaking.
Thank you, Mary. So we brought you to the point where you spoke about how those childhood experiences, those experiences of growing up in Northern Ireland, and then the experiences of wanting to do your own conviction of wanting to do something about those experiences and those divisions, and the fact that we as human beings cannot sustain this kind of perpetual wars, suffering, trauma. What I want you to perhaps now turn our attention to is, all that process, that long process that led to the Good Friday peace agreement. And I want you to think of two things. I want you to think of the challenges. And for all of us here in this room, let's keep in mind that we have various conflicts around the world, not just in, with respect to, not just in the Ukrainian and Russian conflict and then the Hamas and Israeli conflict, but we have many, many conflicts around the world. So when you answer this question, Mary, maybe think about the challenges that we continue to face to address various conflicts, but then also the possibilities and the recipes that we haven't considered that perhaps we should consider. And on a number of occasions, when you speak about possibilities and recipes for success, you often speak about graciousness, pragmatism, tonality. I've heard you say this on a number of occasions. So it's not just about what we do in terms of a set of rules, but there is something about the humanization of the very process and the personalization of the process that seems to me to be part of the recipe for success. Can you speak about those?
It's about interrupting ways of dealing with each other politically. In the case of Northern Ireland, but I see it also in Gaza, one sees it in Ukraine, one sees it replicated in many conflicts, the hate-filled tone of the discussions on both sides. Both sides adamant that the other is, and the othering of the other is all about me, characterizing them as evil, characterizing me, my side, as the victim, the other side is always the baddie. And so the language is very often raw. That kind of raw language is the same as killing people. If in the tit-for-tat killing that keeps hell going among neighbours, as it did in Ireland, Northern Ireland, the language also that is used also keeps hell going. It keeps churning up the hatred, and you need the fuel of the hatred to keep the conflict going. So to interrupt that, you need a new kind of language. We were fortunate in Northern Ireland that that language was introduced to us by an American, by a representative sent by President Clinton, and that was George Mitchell. George Mitchell should be canonized in his lifetime for what he had to listen to, for all those years in Ireland. But we cannot, at the end of the day, he brought parties into each other's orbit at a time when they would not speak to each other. They would speak to him. And he would then try and infiltrate their thinking, get behind the barriers of the hateful language, the condescension, the lack of compromise, just to see, is there anything in there? Is there anything he could work with? Any little fragment of hope? And one of the tools that he used was gracious language. He never was angry. He was always calm. He never said anything that offended people, which really annoyed them to begin with, because they really wanted to, because they thought if he offended my side, then I know he's on their side, you know? But he offended nobody. And in doing that, he taught all of us the lesson that the language we employ, the tone we employ, can create the conditions that are conducive to discussion. The other thing that he helped to do, and others worked on this, peacemakers were working like busy bees on this, because so many of the main players who had to be involved in bringing about a compromise that led to the Good Friday Agreement 26 years ago now, those people had, many of them, like for example the British government at a stage had said they would never talk to terrorists. Well, if they had never talked to terrorists, we'd never have had a Good Friday Agreement. That's the truth of the matter. If the setting up of barriers to discussion, we in Northern Ireland can steadfastly say, along with one of the great, the wonderful researchers in this area, happens to be a woman called Louise Richardson. She's an expert on political terrorism, and she's an Irish woman, first ever female Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, just recently retired, Dame Louise Richardson. And she has said emphatically through all her career, anybody who's ever resolved a violent conflict, a political conflict, who tells you they never talked to terrorists is not telling the truth. In order to resolve it, you have to talk to them. You're not going to agree with them. Of course you're not going to sit down and say, gee, you know, I really agree with you. You're going to sit down and say, why are you doing this? Why do you do this whenever everything you do is moving away from the ambition you have, as we were able to explain to the paramilitaries in Northern Ireland? For example, those who wanted a united Ireland. That unity was going to involve 1 million Protestants who were hostile to unity. Do you think they were going to be persuaded by being killed? I don't think so. So being able to persuade them that as a wonderful peacemaker called Father Alex Reid, a wonderful peacemaker, I recommend you, he had a wonderful book called Lessons from the Road and the Road to Peace. He was one of the few people who would go and talk to paramilitaries. Everybody else stood off, too proud. We didn't talk to those people. You wouldn't talk to them. He talked to them. He went to the prisons, and he was the first person to notice the key that eventually, a simple key that unlocked the peace process. He realized they were tired. The paramilitaries were tired. They were in prison 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Their kids were coming up now. And they were saying to themselves, well, we haven't got very far, have we? And he was saying to them, you haven't got very far, have you? And have you ever thought of an alternate strategy? And maybe a strategy that would give your children an opportunity that you didn't have? And because they were tired, he was able then to open up that space for discussion. And he set up a discussion between John Hume, the great strategist who brought about the Great Friday Agreement, the wonderful, wonderful thinker. But John Hume wasn't a man who insisted on hardcore principles. He was a pragmatist. He believed very firmly that 100%, if you insisted, as many conflicts insist, on 100% of everything, you end up with 100% of nothing. And the trick in peace building is to persuade that 90% of something is a hell of a lot better than 100% of nothing. Because 100% of nothing means ongoing conflict and instability. 90% of something means everybody has conceded 10% and now has a vested interest in making that process work. They have invested in it. And so this peace builder, Alec Reid, went to the prisons, intuited that, set up meetings between John Hume and a man called Gerry Adams, whom many of you will know from Sinn Féin. At that time, Gerry Adams couldn't be interviewed on television. His voice could not be heard. Sinn Féin, the party that he represented, was not regarded as politically acceptable. Today, a member of Sinn Féin is the First Minister of Northern Ireland. That's the journey we have travelled. And so John Hume and Gerry Adams were brought into each other's orbit by this little priest, this crazy guy, a great friend of mine, a wonderful friend of mine. He used to come into the house in bad humour, and he'd say, "The Holy Spirit's on the subs bench. We'll have to get the Holy Spirit off the subs bench." Or he'd say, "The Holy Spirit was carried off injured." Everything had a footballer hurling metaphor. And there were great metaphors. But he persuaded John Hume to talk to Gerry Adams, believing that John Hume's analysis, the power of it, the integrity of it, allied to the fact that the paramilitaries on the Catholic side were now tired and were beginning to question the way forward. That if he could introduce John Hume to Gerry Adams and could transfer to Adams his thinking, and if Adams could transfer that thinking to the IRA and get them to think more strategically, politically, and move away from violence, we had a chance for peace. And that's exactly what happened. Who were the worst offenders in terms of criticising that meeting between John Hume and Gerry Adams, which continued for a number of years because the violence continued all the time, were John Hume's own people all around him. People around him, his friends and relations were saying, are you insane? The newspapers crucified him. How dare he? I was very fortunate that I was a privileged witness to those talks. Father Alec Reid asked myself and another person to be interlocutors, to go out into the community and say, John Hume is not sitting in there, saying, "Gerry, I agree with everything you believe in." I mean, as if. He was saying, "Gerry, here's what you need to say to the IRA. Here's what the future could look like if they changed from violence to politics. Here's how they could achieve something great rather than keep on injuring the body politic and injuring human beings and killing human beings and actually deeply discrediting the very thing they stood for, a united Ireland." So I was privileged to sit in on those conversations, so I also knew and observed how Gerry Adams treated John Hume. He sat at his feet, the student listening to the master. And that was also very important. That was the relationship. And then he used the power he had to persuade the IRA, who then, of course, went on ceasefire, and the rest is history, are effectively disbanded nowadays. And all of those little pieces only happened because people who were peacemakers stood their ground even when all around them the screaming winds were hurling abuse at them. Alec Reid had to take dreadful abuse. It had a huge impact on his health. John Hume was destroyed by it in terms of his health. And that's the fate of the peacemaker. The fate of the peacemaker is not always to come out of this healthy. John Hume came out of this a victim of stress. I mean, really, seriously? I'm warning you now. It's a vocation for life. You've got to put steel in your spine. There are people out there who are mean and nasty, and unfortunately, with the internet and these platforms that are regarded as publishers, not as publishers, but as platforms, and get away with defamation and destroying people's lives with their language. It's a hate-filled place out there. But we need the voices of contradiction. We need the voices of contradiction. And what Ireland taught me and Northern Ireland taught me is, in the end, the peacemakers triumph. But it's still not over. We still have to be vigilant. We still have to be the peacemakers who, in company, when you hear the word, for example, that is homophobic or sexist or sectarian, you've got to be the voice that says, "Excuse me, see that language? No. If I sit here and stay silent, that language will continue its toxic journey." And even though you're my friend or my brother or my mother or my father or my next door neighbor, I'm sorry, but I have to say to you, I want to be your friend. I want to continue to love you. But this language is not the language of love, and it does not bring love to our world. So when I became president in 1997, before the Good Friday Agreement, and I said, as we were going through the door of the President's house, I had told when I was elected, I had said to the electorate, I'm here on this planet, in this space, with a job to do, and that is to build bridges in places where there's nothing. We don't have healthy relationships. At that time, the border between Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland, that partitioned border, was the land border in the European Union with the least trade across it. Like, go figure the stupidity of that now. The sheer, utter economic stupidity. Your nearest neighbours, we're an island, everything else would have to be shipped off the island or shipped into the island. But what did we do? We ignored the possibilities. Why? Because that was that crowd up there and we were the other crowd down there. We're not dealing with them. No, having nothing to do with them. Now I have to say we have a fabulous trading relationship, and thank God, and of course the Republic of Ireland is now one of the wealthiest economies in the world from a time when it was one of the poorest. So by being open and pragmatic, good things happened. And that's the story, really. That's the story for peacemakers. You are the people who are going to be saying, would you just give 10%? Do you think you could squeeze 10% to make a compromise? Is peace worth it to you? And we discovered after the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement agreed among the politicians and then put by referendum to the people, north and south, overwhelmingly endorsed by the people. And what did that tell me? That there is a yesness for peace deep in the heart of people, and they will follow good leadership. That if leadership is offered, they will follow it. And if it's not offered, we will do the cowardly thing. We'll stay in the place we were conscripted into as children. We won't break out. But good leaders can teach us to push out into the deep. And again, to quote Seamus Heaney, that there is a further shore that's reachable from here, even though it looks like you're going to drown. And that's what leaders, and everybody who's a peace builder, has to be that kind of leader. I said when I went into the House of the President that I was going to reach out to all those constituencies that over their dead body would come to the House of the President, over their dead body. The Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, he ended up having a breakfast with us in the House. That took about 6 years. And my view was, I'll talk to anybody, bring in the parent, I don't care who they are. If they are people that need to be talked to in order to build a bridge, we'll talk to them. And over time, my husband and I worked on it relentlessly. We ate for Ireland. You can see the signs on me now. And we did something that was very important. We brought people into the House. We had a cup of tea, we talked about kids and holidays, we stayed away from hardcore politics because we were always going to invite them back. We were never, ever about photo ops. It was never about, see a pet Protestant, or see, because I'd been always in the past in the North, the pet Catholic, or the pet woman. And I hated that. This was about real friendship building, and you don't build friendships in 1 minute. You have to be there for people again and again and again, so that, for example, today, and I'm out of office a long time now, my husband every week will be in touch with loyalist Protestant paramilitaries whom he has befriended and formed a trusting relationship with. And the trust was built from day one when we said, you want to take a picture, that's fine. We are not sending this out to the press. We are here to build friendships, not for instant photo ops. And I think politics and politicians have got to be careful of that. The photo op syndrome, to me, has done a lot of damage to trust building. And we didn't do that. But I said to my husband the day we went into the House of the President in November 1997, I'd say, we are going to find out here. I thought I was going to be there for 7 years, but I was re-elected, so I was there for 14 years. I said, in 7 years, we will find out if the great commandment to love one another really works, because that's what we're going to try and do. And it's what we did for the 14 years. And at the end of that 14 years, in the last months of it, I was able to bring Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Elizabeth, to Ireland. She had never, ever set foot in the Republic. In 100 years, no monarch, no English monarch had set foot in the Republic of Ireland. The reasons were obvious. You know, history had conferred that level of enmity. I had befriended, or she had befriended me, whichever way you want to look at it, from before I was president, when in 1995. By God's grace, somehow we met, and I explained to her, I'm not a monarchist, I'm a Republican, but that when she spoke, I grew up in Northern Ireland, she was the Queen of Northern Ireland, but I never felt she was my Queen. She would talk about her loyal subjects, and the minute I heard that phrase, I knew that's not me. I'm not one of them. And I said, so I never felt you outreach to my community. And we talked, and she said, I said, you know, if I ever there's an opportunity for me to help you in your work, and she told me that she really, really always had wanted to visit the Republic. I was living and working living in the north, working in Belfast and Queen's University, and I had no idea that I would be the president within the next 2 years. But she reminded me at the first opportunity that she had wanted to come. And I said, well, we'll work towards that. And we did. But of course, with an army of peace builders and peacemakers who were doing all sorts of things, women's groups at community level, cross-community groups, getting to know each other, listening to each other, beginning to examine their own version of history over and against the other's version of history, and beginning to realize, actually, there's bits missing here. The whole story of the First World War, told so badly, you wouldn't believe it. In the North, the story was only Protestants wore the British uniform in the First World War. Catholics didn't have anything to do with it. Why? Because in 1916, right in the middle of that war, a small group of Catholics, and indeed some Protestants, in the Republic had rebelled against British rule in the Rising. And so it suited the Republic never to admit that there were men at that time in British uniform fighting in Belgium. And it suited Northern Protestants to preen themselves that they were the only ones who supported little Belgium and democracy. The truth is, 200,000 volunteers from all over the island of Ireland wore British uniform. 50,000 of them died, the vast majority of them Catholic Irish nationalists. When we found that, suddenly we realized we've all told lies about this to flatter the vanity of our versions of history. Now we need to tell this the right way up. And if we do, we'll create a platform of shared memory. We can go with each other to the Somme. We can go with each other and stand beside one another, shoulder to shoulder, at the monuments in Ireland, including in Dublin, where these great heroes were commemorated, but rapidly forgotten. And that has been, again, a very powerful tool. So you need an army of people doing all sorts of little bits and pieces of analysis and work to break open the narrative, interrupt the language, interrupt the narrative. And that's the work, and that's the vocation, and that's the challenge of peacemakers. And in that house, over those 14 years, Her Majesty the Queen came in 2011 against the better judgment of every diplomat on our side, against the better judgment, sorry diplomats, of every diplomat on her side. I had to be utterly, utterly ruthless. Seriously, to say, it's happening, it has to happen, it will work well. There were obvious fears from the security people, they were legitimate fears, but even when we were agreeing where she would go, there was that gravitational pull of what I'll call cowardice, you know. Yes, let's do the safe things. And I said, no. We're not going to just do the safe things. She's going to go to the Garden of Remembrance, where everybody in that Garden of Remembrance is somebody who tried to get rid of people like her out of Ireland, right? She's going to go to Croke Park, where our national games are played, and where in November 1920, British troops came onto the pitch in the middle of a match and shot dead 14 people. That's where she's going to go. And I'm going to ask her, will she use a little bit of the Irish language? Because for the 19th century, the British tried their best to kill off the Irish language, believing if you kill language, you kill culture, and you eventually repress the people. You make them compliant. But she, to be good to her, with her great skill, she and I were able to set up a back channel and agree what she would do. One of the things that she said that her representative, thanks to our dear friend Francis Campbell, who was the British ambassador to the Holy See, but also a good friend of mine and a neighbour from Northern Ireland, he helped facilitate. I was told emphatically that she would not use the Irish language. Not because she wanted to be unhelpful, but actually she thought it would be more helpful, because if she got a word wrong or a nuance wrong, all the people who didn't want her there would say, look, it's already a dismal failure. But I happen to say, I'm only talking about 5 words. I'm not talking about like a PhD in Irish. I'm talking about 5 words. And the ambassador, Francis Campbell, came to my house and I wrote them out phonetically for him after we'd already agreed that the subject was closed and we were never going to mention it again. But he said, I just want to know what the 5 words were. And so when she got up to speak, and the only time she made a speech in Dublin Castle, the first words she used were those 5 words. And she brought the house down. And she brought the house down all over Ireland, because all over Ireland people were saying, sweet suffering Jesus, did Her Majesty the Queen just speak Irish? Perfectly with an Ulster accent as well. So it was pretty obvious where the language came from. Unreal. And there you go, the small iconic gesture, the 10%, the 10% that meant so much. She went to the Garden of Remembrance. She didn't have to go there, but she agreed to go there. And she put a wreath down to the men and women who had tried to get rid of British rule. And then she stood back and she did something completely unscripted. She bowed her head in homage. And again, the whole of Ireland went, did we really see that? Did that really happen? Did that happen? Again, graciousness, generosity, going the little bit extra. And then she went to Croke Park and she stood on the sward right where the British troops had killed those people. And when it was said to her by the president of the GAA, this is where Bloody Sunday happened in November 1920. And very sadly and audibly she said, I know. And we knew that she did know, and that she had come not as a tourist, she'd come to make peace, because peace mattered to her. And this was her great opportunity. When she left Ireland, she was there for 4 days, the diplomats, one of them was sent to me to say, look, could we not just have her for half a day? And I said, you call that the bum's rush. You do not call that a state visit. She will come on a state visit or she doesn't come at all. So we had her for 4 days. And highly secure, of course. But again, we realized that just getting to know her and listening to her and seeing those little gestures, she was able to strip away all the things, the hardened hearts. And I got a lovely letter she got thousands of letters, more posts about that than about any state visit in her history. I got a load of letters, including one that began, I'm a 90-year-old Republican, I've no time for monarchs. And I thought, oh, here we go. And she said, I thought you were wrong to invite the monarch from next door. And I was very upset about it. And then I thought, well, I'll watch her arrival at least on television. I'll give it 5 minutes. And she said, 4 days later, the television nearly combusted because it was on the whole time. And she said, when the Queen left to go back home, I realized that the event was choreographed by the angels. It actually wasn't. There wasn't an angel among them. But far from it. But then God works in mysterious ways. And those words to me were solid gold. Solid gold. And they told me of the capacity each of us has, no matter how hardened the hearts. There is a huge capacity for change, to be persuaded to something better, something bigger, something noble. And at the heart of that, you have to infuse that with grace. And she did that over those days and created, I have to say, a wonderful climate until, of course, came Boris and wrecked the whole thing.
So I think all of us have had a wonderful opportunity to listen to the richness of this world leader. We had a number of questions. I am going to apologize, but I suspect that a number of these questions have been addressed implicitly or explicitly by you. Your graciousness to come to Washington, D.C. for basically 24 hours and then turn right around and go back to Ireland is beyond words. But you model for us what it means to care for something so much that you are willing to get on a plane, fly to Washington, and fly back to Ireland. You've given us lots of food for thought in terms of, as you were speaking, I couldn't help myself but to think about something that we no longer teach, the art of rhetoric. And I was thinking of St. Augustine. Listen, in his famous, it is not just what you say in the Doctrina Cristiana, but how you say it. So we have lost the art of, it's not just following of a certain objective, but the modality, how we do it, how it is done, right? And so you have pointed the way in terms of the compassion, the graciousness, the personal. I always, in my own experience, I think of the tabletop diplomacy behind closed doors in a dinner, in a conversation where you begin to befriend another and you allow for those guardrails to come down and for the humanity to come through and for them to see that you're not an enemy, but that you want what is really best in the best interest.
This is the joy of diplomacy, but also peacemaking, nuance.
Right.
You see, when you live in binary world, them, us, my history, their history, there's no room for nuance. But you need nuance to build peace, to open up the little spaces that get people critiquing, checking their own facts, willing to change. So you need that nuance. But there's, Father Alec Reid, I mentioned earlier, had a great expression. He'd always say, "Blessed are the peacemakers, they will never be unemployed."
So I think on that note, I want all of us here present in the overflow room and those of us that have joined us in terms of the cyberspace world to thank you, Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland, for coming here with us and inspiring us, for challenging us to go beyond the status quo, and for that invitation, leaving us that invitation to really not give up, no matter how hard things are, and to trust that those angels, whether choreographing some event or in our hearts, will in fact produce the changes that our world so desperately needs and desires. Thank you for coming.
Just give us a second. We're going to set up really quickly for the next session.
Impossible.
Is Peter coming on? So we have somebody zooming in?
Yes.
Oh, there's Peter. Okay. Oh, he's there. Okay. Thank you so much. I hope that didn't disappoint and you saw why I was overwhelmed by what the students were talking about. Okay, so now we want to get a little bit more practical and pragmatic. The conference is Status Quo No More, Advancing the Peacebuilding Field. How do we do this? So I'm going to start with you, Peter. Peter, who's on screen, who couldn't be here today. I'm not holding that against you. Peter, you and I talk about this all the time. You are the executive director of the Civil Society Peacebuilding State Building Platform, CSPPS. What is this platform that we talk about when we talk about IDPS, the International Dialogue for Peacebuilding and State Building? We haven't had a big peacebuilding document since 2016, the Stockholm document. That was 8 years ago. So how important is this IDPS platform? I'm sure many of you don't even know what it is. What is it? Why is it important? How can it push the peacebuilding field forward? Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Liz, and good afternoon, everybody. And apologies for not being able to join you today in Washington, D.C., but to join you online. First of all, what a fascinating and inspiring opening session you had. And these words that were said are still resonating with me. So I'll try to weave that also a little bit into my response to your question on what is the international dialogue, what is it doing, is it relevant, what should it do? I mean, it has been in long existence. I mean, the International Dialogue on Peacebuilding and State Building is in existence since 2008 when donor agencies realized that aid delivered to countries in conflict settings was not yielding the impact that it was foreseen to have. And for that, it felt that it needed to come up with a solution that was more focused, more country-led, country-owned, and targeted aid deliverance to those countries. And that led to the creation of an international dialogue process, including governments of so-called fragile and conflict-affected countries, including also civil society, through what later became the Civil Society Platform for Peacebuilding and State Building, which is a global network of civil society organizations supporting peacebuilding efforts in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Over the years, I mean, we have been trying to address the thorny issues of conflict and fragility and looking at conflict in country, but also global drivers of conflict and instability impacting these countries. And I think the dialogue has been manifesting itself over time as an innovative, but also very relevant political dialogue mechanism, providing an open and frank domain for discussion and discourse about how to tackle some of those problems. Have we been successful? I mean, after all these years of it being in existence, the dialogue is not really broadly known. I think. I mean, it's an introud who is engaging in that dialogue process, and there's progress made, but it's not ending on the front pages of newspapers. But then again, I do think that having the ability to have this continuous political dialogue process with governments, but also with interested parties to actually help and support governments to make the transition towards greater resilience, and also includes civil society organizations in that process, is an important segue for creating stability. And what we see in the current day of time is that this dialogue is now looking at the potential rethink, given the fact that there was a declaration issued, as you said, in 2016, when donor representatives, governments, fragile countries, civil society leaders came together in Stockholm. And there's a need for a recalibration of that international dialogue, looking at today's challenges, looking at today's world that is confronted with what was said also in the introduction, multiple conflicts, and not only the Gaza conflict or the war in Ukraine, but I mean, there's over 55 conflicts across the world, and we need to be able to provide a reality and a solution to all these conflicts in terms of what we can potentially do in supporting lasting solutions towards sustaining peace. That's the reason why we now are looking at the rethink and bringing in the reality of today, but also develop new innovative ways and new partnerships in bringing that peace building and conflict prevention agenda forward. Back to you.
So thank you, Peter, and I want to give you a big shout out. About 2 years ago, Peter called me and said, Liz, we're not walking the walk. CS, PPS, and AFP aren't really connected anymore, and we have to be connected. If we're going to, and Nick Haley, one of our wonderful board members, when we were talking about collective action, we have to walk the walk and be interconnected and working together collectively. So that's what Peter and I do all the time now. And you know, we can say we have these two large networks working together. So Peter, kudos to you. Shamal, you lead the largest peacebuilding dedicated organization. And you grapple with these issues all the time. How do you build and advance this field? What are the challenges that you're seeing and the successes, and how do we go forward?
Thanks very much. And thank you to USIP and Alliance for Peacebuilding and their respective leadership for having me here. And I really have a lot of respect and honestly love for the people in this room and the organizations that you all lead and are part of, and those who are joining us online. I didn't tell you, but several months ago when you first sent out the AFP PeaceCon notice for this year, I got it on my phone and I thought, well, that's not very inspiring because it pulled up a little wonky and it cut off the last two words. So all I saw was PeaceCon 2024, status quo. So now that I understand the theme, I've just changed my, no, I'm making light of a serious topic. I think this is a really fortuitous time for this conversation and for this global community because, we're here in Washington, D.C. We have a very consequential election coming up, obviously. And I think no matter who wins, I really believe that this question of how to end wars and translate the ending of those wars to processes that can bring an enduring end to the conflicts that give rise to those wars is going to be the primary foreign policy challenge. And we can see that with months-long of failed efforts to just secure a ceasefire in Gaza, in Sudan, in DRC, just to name a few of the 55 conflicts Peter mentioned. And so I think those of us assembled here, diplomats, the funders, the non-governmental organization leaders, civil society activists, academics, I think marshaling the best of us to try to help answer that question, I think will be really vitally important. I want to maybe stick, on your question list, maybe sort of 3 elements that I feel like have shifted and require us to really look in the mirror. The first is political, the second is institutional, and the third is about who drives this work, who does this work. I think in terms of the political, I think the impact of the organizations that advance peacebuilding as part of their mission, being as reliant as we are on a limited number of politically aligned Western governments, has always been a challenge and is becoming a real serious detriment. This understanding is dawned on at the diplomatic level. We can see, even in the darkest conflicts that we've seen, the limited breakthroughs that we've had have been achieved not by the absence of Western powers, but by their complementing and partnering with other partners outside of that nexus. The Black Sea grain deal would not have been achieved without Turkey. The one ceasefire that got over 100 hostages released and more than double that of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails released would not have been accomplished without Qatar and Egypt. Even more recently, U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan, Perriello, excuse me, in the convening in Switzerland, would not have gone forward and didn't achieve a ceasefire, but did achieve an opening of a critical humanitarian corridor. Wouldn't have been done without Saudi Arabia and Switzerland. So at the diplomatic level, this is increasingly clear and recognized. I think it has to be recognized and filtered throughout the entire peacebuilding field. I had said this for some time, and I found it troubling how many peacebuilding organizations rushed into Afghanistan on the heels of an invasion, and even more troublingly, rushed for the exits when Western governments were essentially kicked out. I'm not critiquing in any way any Afghan citizens who could and decided and were able to leave. That's not what I'm saying. But I think for an organization like ours, what this has meant is looking at the fact that we have headquarters in Brussels and Washington, D.C., and that's insufficient. And so on my itinerary, increasingly this year, next year, is multiple trips now to Qatar, to Kenya, to South Africa, to South Korea, places where we're looking to significantly globalize our governance. But at the political level, I think this is important. At the institutional level, the multilateral system that was set up, the post-World War II system that was set up to prevent wars and foster cooperation, we know is not fit for purpose. There's a whole summit for the future coming up in a few days, a few hundred miles from here, in recognition of that. There are ways, while the momentum for serious and real reform and that pressure continues to build and get frustrated, but continues to build, there are ways in which I think those of us in different positions can complement, even maybe jerry-rig the system a little bit to help it to do a better job. I had gotten a call almost exactly this time last year from Martin Griffiths, who at that time was the Undersecretary General, UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, who, as people may know, came out of our field, came out of the peace, didn't come out of the humanitarian sector as much as the peacebuilding sector. It founded the Humanitarian Dialogue Center. And Martin said, look, I established this humanitarian negotiation unit within my office because out of the recognition that there are many difficult actors we have to negotiate with to gain access to for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in need of support. And that when we open up those relations, sometimes political openings open up that, if channeled correctly, might actually be able to help end some of these violent conflicts. But he said, I'm going to tell you 2 stories and then I have a proposition for you, and I could tell you 50. He said, first, when I want to send somebody from this negotiation unit, when I want to deploy them, it takes 21 days for the system here to get a ticket issued, an airplane ticket issued. He said, second, the last time that one of these key negotiators was in Kabul, he was invited by maybe the most important or one of the most senior Taliban leaders to stay in his family compound. This was the result of 15 years of trust building. And so the negotiator called Martin, and Martin said, you have to do this. But when they hung up the phone, the mission on the ground wouldn't allow him to stay there. So he went back to his 5-star hotel in Kabul. And Martin's proposition was, I want to find a way to deploy and mobilize these negotiators with much greater flexibility and adaptability. I want to partner with an organization like yours. So we piloted this with one of those negotiators over this last year. We've learned a lot of lessons. It's been incredibly valuable. Both in terms of what it was intended to do, but also in connecting some of the community peace-building work that our teams support around the world to some of these political processes. And so we're now trying to look at how can that now be institutionalized, that kind of partnership between that unit and an NGO. It's a novel and new thing, so there are a million ways in which it could get destroyed within a big institution like the UN before it even gets born. But there are ways in which, if we each look at our respective strengths and weaknesses, we might be able to strengthen, the overall system. And the last thing is really who's driving this peace-building work. There's one of the biggest pushes, not just in the peace-building sector, but international development generally, and philanthropy, has been localization, or supporting those who are most proximate to a problem in terms of them having the decision-making authority of how to solve that problem. And I think in conflict and peace-building in particular, local is not enough. I think it's really critical to support multi-partial teams. And by multi-partial, I mean not impartial or neutral, but teams and networks that are drawn from across the dividing lines, whether they be ethnic, political, generational, gender, religious, whatever that might be. And that might very well be a single local civil society organization that has made the effort to build those networks. It might be a coalition of local actors who have taken the time to build that kind of multi-partial team and coalition. But it's not enough to just be local. I was talking to the head of, not the head, but someone very senior at one of the largest foundations that everybody here would know about this, and they have a presence in Nigeria, as an example. But when you look at it, literally more than 90% of the decision makers in that office, in terms of programming and funding, are Christian. This is in a country with almost 50% of the population is Muslim. I think it's the 5th most populous Muslim country in the world. That they're all local. I don't think they're going to have the insights without doing a lot of work to really be building bridges across dividing lines. So those are 3 things that I would highlight that I think are important for us to really confront and shift.
Talking about nuance, right? That's what I'm picking up. Okay, Ambassador Moose. George. You have an incredible, distinguished career as a diplomat, and I'm going to actually tell a little funny story. About 2 years ago, we were on a panel together speaking to students at, I think, GW, and you said, I'm going to be relaxing more. I think you were getting off of the board even of USIP, and I chuckled and said, yeah, right. So how's that going, that relaxing?
Yeah. Well, actually, if one has to be somewhere doing something, I can't think of a better place to be or better work to be doing. But to your point, as you know well, I began my career working the other side of 23rd Street, across the street at the State Department. So it's hard to take the diplomatic out of the former diplomat, as much as I'm trying to improve. But I'm also, as you know, deeply committed to this field of peacebuilding. I had the pleasure of serving on the board of Search for Common Ground for 14 years. I served on the board here at USIP for 16. So I have great respect for, appreciation for, I value greatly the work of this community and have tried in various ways to contribute to it. But I'm also mindful that in every community, sometimes we get to be complacent, and we get to be too comfortable with the practices of the past and the things we know how to do well. And I'm also mindful of the fact that, our world has changed dramatically. Certainly since the late 60s when I joined the State Department, and even in the last 40 years, even in the last 2 decades. And we can go through and enumerate all those changes. The reality is that we have more conflict going on in the world today than we did 20 years ago, reversing the trend from the 1980s and 1990s. We have a conflict landscape that is far more cluttered and fractured than it was 20 years ago. We have far more actors in that space. Some seeking, we think with good intent, to play a positive roles, but others we know quite dramatically are doing just the opposite. We have this immediacy now connection between local conflicts and global conflicts. Now, we've got a war going on in Europe, which has metastasized in all kinds of ways and is manifesting itself in conflicts all around the world. I think of the part of the world that I know best, which is Africa, where you see the Russia-Ukraine conflict playing out in the likes of the Africa Corps and the former Wagner Group and what they're doing there. And that's not the only place in the world that's happening. And then we have these extraordinary new disruptors and drivers that we are dealing with. Even within the last 20 years, Search was a pioneer in the use of media and social media for peace building. But we also know that those technologies and those platforms are being very effectively exploited by the folks who are trying to do evil in the world. In fact, that it is far easier to exploit those technologies and those platforms for that purpose. And then we layer on top of all of that the realities of the new global shocks, climate being principal among them, and the impact that has on food production, on health, on migration, and all the rest. And so that conflict landscape is far more complicated than it used to be. And that's not to say the old drivers of conflict are still there. The whole old challenges of social cohesion, of economic inequity, of religious, social, political differences, all those things have not changed. It's simply that we have now layered on top of them whole new complexities of conflict and drivers of conflict. And so, again, thinking as one who spent those 37 years across the street as a diplomat, I have great empathy and sympathy for my colleagues and friends in the diplomatic and national security space who are trying to figure out how to deal with these things. And I also have to say, I have to question whether we as peace builders have indeed kept pace with the rapidity of and the complexity of those changes. I am a firm believer in the concepts of inclusive peace building. We practice that every day here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. But it's not entirely clear to me that proposing to my friends across the street that we bring more women and youth and others to the negotiating table, whether they see that as an adequate response to dealing with the likes of Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, or the morphed version of the Wagner Group in the Africa Corps. And so I think, first and foremost, we need to be a bit more sympathetic to the challenges that they are facing in their space. And I think we have to be a bit more questioning of ourselves as to whether or not the solutions that we are offering are, in fact, relevant to the challenges with which they are dealing. And I hope, frankly, that in the next 2.5 days that some of you, all of you, will find occasion to ask those questions and to figure out how, because if we don't answer those questions properly, we're not going to succeed in the first part of your agenda, Liz, which was how do we more urgently and compellingly tell the story of the value of the work that we as a community do.
Okay, so we hear a lot of times, there's so many crises, there's so many conflicts, that naivete about peace building and conflict prevention. How do we convince the public, policymakers, how do we convince them that prevention has to be a first priority, that it has to be centered? And more importantly, because we're getting there, we're getting that in there, you got to implement it. What does it look like practically? So Peter, back to you. What are some very practical steps that we could be taking?
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and thanks for the previous speakers. I mean, just reiterating that indeed the context in which we operate has changed. And I think the challenges that we are confronted with have become also increasingly intertwined and interlinked, and that adds to the necessity of bringing in a thorough review of the toolbox that we're utilizing as peace builders and working in the field of conflict prevention. But at the same time, I think the element that we have been maybe not sufficiently including in our, I mean, yes, we have been communicating what we have been doing, and we have been using social media, we have been telling stories, but we have not been able to translate the need for prioritization and resourcing of conflict prevention and peace building in a thorough way that both the governments and high-level leaders acknowledge and integrate this into their policies, but also the general public about seeing the need and being convinced of also the cost effectiveness of investing in prevention and peace building. And I think that is where a challenge lies, that we have to, I mean, if we want to accelerate and support prioritization of conflict prevention and peace building, and also provide adequate and predictable and sustainable financing to it, you also need to be able to generate something of a support trust building element in it that both policymakers, but also the general public see that the investment in that, although it is longer term strategy, longer term work, is an investment that is needed. And I think that the policymakers currently, and if I speak from my own country or the European context, at this point in time, the priority lies on very short-term quick fixes or potential fixes, which are perceived fixes of problems of things that the societies in Europe are confronted with. But these quick fixes are not solving the problem. It's not addressing the root causes of why, for instance, people migrate, or why conflicts emerge, or why crises emerge and turn into violent conflicts. And I think that storytelling also about how, in a holistic sense, things are intertwined, interlinked, and should be elaborated, is also a story that we as peace builders should, in more greater attention, should focus on in telling and look at the interlinkages and also explain that investments in conflict prevention is also not a standalone issue. I mean, prevention of conflicts is also linked to how we can provide health care, or how we can address poverty issues, or how we can be confronting the challenges of climate change. So that it is a different kind of narrative, it's a different kind of interaction with related fields that are also pressing challenges upon local peace builders and local actors trying to secure a sustainable future. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. Shamal?
I mean, I couldn't agree more with the call for more innovative and creative approaches. I think, and sometimes there's just a lack of political will. So the question is really around how do you generate that political will? I mean, to take, again, Israel-Palestine as an example, I don't think, it gets talked about all the time as it's just so complex, it's just so complex, it's just so complex. I think it is complex, and I think it's made a lot more complex when some of the most basic elements of peace building are ignored for decades. So it's not so much that, well, we have to try new things. Part of it is we just have to keep trying what we've been doing, actually, with a lot more political will generated and a lot more pressure put on to mobilize. But having said that, I think what's interesting is in at least what we're seeing is more recognition in philanthropic circles and among regular citizens, particularly in Western countries where there's a lot of philanthropy, here in the US and elsewhere, of the need for prevention. Not necessarily, and I'm talking about foundations, family foundations, massive, big foundations, everything in between, not because they're adopting peace building as their mission, but out of what I'm seeing is two recognitions. One, many of them are realizing over the last 10 years that their societies aren't nearly as stable as they thought they were. And they're realizing, oh, conflict isn't just something over there. Actually, we're falling apart here at home, whether home is the Netherlands or US or wherever it might be. The second is they are supporting all kinds of causes, climate causes, women's rights, education, and they're realizing that if we don't deal with conflict dynamics, our progress on these things are severely blocked or even reversed after decades of progress. That recognition, which many in the peacebuilding field have been advocating for, and forward-thinking policymakers have been from inside advocating for a long time, is becoming much more of it. It's a lot easier to make the case to a broader public that this is a priority because they're living it every day and they're realizing it. It hasn't necessarily led to a flood of new investment in the field, but I think it is leading to more engagement, and over time it will lead to more of that investment. And again, I think that private sector and that philanthropic investment is so critical because it enables you not to replace the support from various governments, but to really complement it in ways that enable you to do very creative things. That UN partnership I mentioned, we never could have gotten going if it wasn't for 3 forward-thinking foundations. I think the last thing I would say is to come back to this, the point I was making about multipartiality and the importance of joint leadership. I think with some of the technological developments that George and others have alluded to, and President McAleese was talking about, I think it's very difficult. I think it's an understatement to say it's very difficult to be a unifying leader today. I would almost say that it's impossible, that the age of the unifying individual leader is dead for a while. Because it's just, I had the privilege over the last few months, I'm name dropping a little bit, but I was so excited. I had the privilege to meet with President Obama, and a couple of weeks after that with Jacinda Ardern, the former president of New Zealand, who had took office at the age of 37. And one of the things that was interesting to me in listening to them is they were both talking about, these are people who ran and won elections on platforms of unity and unification. And both reflected very openly the degree to which they felt that they had failed to unify their countries. And Obama made reference to the speech he gave on the 50th anniversary of the March from Selma to Montgomery, which the Republican pollster Frank Luntz has said was the most unifying speech in terms of how much it resonated across Republican and Democratic lines. And Obama knew this, Luntz had told him this, and yet he said, you know, if you polled the same people today, just a few years later, he said, I bet you 50% of those people think I'm the Antichrist. And I think it's, and so if that's the case, if people of that level of political skill, I'd love to see a conversation between them and President McAleese, but if people of that skill and genuine desire to unify are struggling that much in a world where it's so easy to sow dissension, sow misinformation, sow fear into populations, where small extremes can have a big impact on mainstreams, I think the best way to counter that is more coalition building, more joint leadership, more multi-partial teams, more teams of rivals in governance. I think it's not just a nice to have, it's increasingly necessary. And this goes way beyond the peacebuilding field. I think when the TED people have their talks, they should do more TED dialogues, like the one that went viral this year between the Israeli and the Palestinian. When people are running leadership programs, they shouldn't just support individual leaders, they should have people apply based on their collective constituency to come in as pairs, Muslim, Jewish, Republican, Democrat, Hutu, Tutsi, whatever it might be. There needs to be, and I think there's a real opportunity for that, going back to my first point, which is because more and more people outside of government and policy are realizing if we don't figure this out, everything else is mortgaged, everything else is unattainable.
No, collective, again, you're going back to that collective piece. And if we pull together, we have more agency than we think. And we really, I've talked with a number of you about this. We could learn something from the humanitarian sector. You know, they really pulled together in the 80s and the 90s. They put together this humanitarian council, and it's one of the things that we're looking at and pushing for, you know, to force us to do what Peter did, to call me up and say, hey, this isn't working. We have to work together. It's something that you and I talked about last night, George, at dinner was, you know, we are getting these statements by President Biden, by the UN Secretary General. The Germans even put it on page 40, put it in their new security policy, but it's not trickling down. How do you get these great prevention promises and words to trickle down into the bureaucracy?
No, excellent question. And so let's start, Liz, with this landscape isn't as gloomy as we've sort of painted it thus far. The fact of the matter is that the alliance and USIP had an enormous success just a couple of years ago, right? Which was totally unexpected. That growing out of a task force, a senior study group that was co-hosted by USIP and a couple of other think tanks around town, came this consensus around the notion of fragility and how it was core and central to the challenges we were facing in a whole range of issues. And lo and behold, within a matter of a few months, this community came together, succeeded in getting the Congress to pass on a bipartisan basis a major piece of legislation called the Global Fragility Act, right? And not only that, then got funding to support that initiative. So it's not as though things are entirely bleak and dismal out there. But I will say, and I do appreciate, and frankly in some respects share, the frustration with what has happened since. That the promise of the Global Fragility Act has, I think in the minds of many of us, has not been fully realized. But what message should we take from that? I think one of the messages is that maybe we need to regroup around what it is, how do we sustain and support this initiative so that we can demonstrate that, in fact, the conceptualization, that the original idea still has merit. Mm-hmm. And it does have merit. I think in some respects, we have not focused properly on where it applies and where it doesn't. I think arguably when we said that we should test Sudan as the proposition for the Global Fragility Act, that was a serious miscalculation because Sudan was not fragile; it was broken by the time we got there. Similarly with Libya, similarly with Haiti. So I think we need to be much more focused on how do we make the most of this tool, this instrument that has been created with bipartisan support on the Hill. Clearly, it resonated with a lot of people. And we also have to have conversations with our colleagues, State Department and elsewhere, about it was intended to be an agile, flexible tool, an instrument that was responsive, that we could use to respond quickly to situations. And as often happens in Washington, it's become highly bureaucratized. And we need to figure out how we encourage and support our colleagues to do that. But I think this is not just for us. It's not just for us sitting here in Washington. This is a whole of community effort, a conversation. We have to demonstrate that we are doing our work so that others will see that there is a value in investing in the work that we are doing.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience? I don't know if we have do you have a mic runner?
I think we do. I think we do.
Thank you. Paul Miller, Lutheran World Relief, part of Chorus International, and also I'm an adjunct professor, so I can criticize at night what I do during the day. This is an excellent presentation. President McAleese said, don't miss religion.
Yes.
But something else I'm not hearing is, what was that folk singer song? Masters of War, the dark side of globalization, war economies, gold, coltan, poppies, endangered animals. I'm not hearing weapons exports that leave a dock in Virginia, that go across the border to Mexico. I'm not hearing that. I'm not part of the peacebuilding community directly, yet I'm not hearing discussions about the things that really potentiate and supercharge the bad actors. I'm just wondering if there's a response, or there is a lot of work going on here that I'm not hearing about. Over.
Talking about the root causes.
Root causes.
Is there another? We want to take another question?
This one over here.
Yes?
I'm probably loud enough.
No.
Lynn, you're not.
Yeah, Lynn Carter, Alliance for Peacebuilding. Prevention seems to me to require a runway of some kind. And in many of these environments, you just mentioned Libya, there doesn't look like there's much of a runway. So where do we determine where we can use prevention, where we need a different toolkit entirely? And when I look at prevention in places that are really conflict affected, they're kind of micro programs, and there's no scale to them. So how do you even hope to get traction in that with prevention strategies? Thanks. Someone else. Other.
Okay, why don't we take these two questions over to you all.
Well, gosh, both great questions. On the runway one, and I think that's what I was kind of trying to get at. There are situations which do not lend themselves to the kinds of tools that we were seeking to build within the GFA, and we need to recognize that. But there are others where we have opportunity. There is runway, there is possibility. I would look, for example, at coastal West Africa as one of those places. There's still some runway, even though that runway is getting shorter and shorter, right? That's a place where we should have been working for years, because we could see what was happening in the Sahel, neighboring countries, and what was coming towards the coastal West Africa, but there is still runway there. I would argue that Mozambique is another one of those places where, notwithstanding the current conflict, there is still runway, there's still possibility for something like that. But to the other question, yes, you were speaking to exactly what I was trying to get at, which is that we need to understand the ways in which conflict has changed and the drivers of conflict have changed. We are at the moment, all of us, pursuing this dream of a green economy and our cell phones and our Teslas, and ignoring the reality that in so doing, we are underwriting the exploitation of critical minerals in extremely fragile parts of the world, contributing to local conflicts, economic inequity, which is going to plague us for years. And we need to be talking about that. We need to be talking about, okay, what is our response to how mining gets done in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? How are we going to address the governance issues around the mining of critical minerals in those parts of the world? How are we going to address the economic and environmental impacts that are craving, rightly so, for a more sustainable economy is already producing and generating in other parts of the world. And if we don't address that, how are we going to address the competition between China and the United States over in the search for those critical minerals? So we need at least to be able to talk to people in positions of policymakers and national security folks to explain how our solutions are relevant to the challenges that they are facing. And I think there are ways in which we can have those conversations.
Jamo Peter?
I think that without wanting to cheapen the term, I think we are to some extent all living in conflict zones now. I think that in the sense that you look at probably a lot of people saw the Carnegie report on polarization, with polarization defined as not just rankist discord, but where parties see the other as an existential threat. So there's no such thing, all these qualifiers on polarization. Is it toxic polarization? Is it effective polarization? There's no good polarization if you define polarization as you see the other party as an existential threat. Nothing good comes of that. And what Carnegie was reporting was that, looking back to 1900, every region of the world, with the exception of Oceania, I think it is, which tells us what we all already knew, we should all live in South Pacific, but what they had was at higher levels of polarization than at any time since 1900, with the exception of Europe before World War I and World War II. And that the spike in the level of polarization over the last 10 to 15 years was at unprecedented or nearly unprecedented levels in every region of the world. So when I think about the question of runway, Where should one do this work? Or I look at the work that, we made a decision many years ago that we wanted to focus our efforts in places where the most consequential conflicts, where millions of lives were at stake, either for good or in uplifting lives if conflict dynamics could be transformed. The distinction between pre-conflict, conflict, and post-conflict, don't get me wrong, I don't want to say that it's irrelevant. If you're living in the middle of, where bombs are dropping, clearly, there are definitions here. But societies are shifting, in my view, back and forth between these dynamics all of the time. And in some of the worst cases, I gave a couple examples of the grain deal, the hostage accord, whatever. It is in the midst of the most hellish violent conflicts sometimes that new relationships are born or new opportunities, or there's finally a realization that we can't go back to where we were. I don't know, and I certainly wouldn't predict because of how, horrible the ongoing war is, but I don't know if we'll be able to get a legitimate and inclusive political process out of the current war, what's going on in the Middle East, right? I don't think we were any closer to an inclusive political process on October 6th. So what does that say to us about, where was the political will to have a genuinely inclusive political process for 20 years? Where was the international pressure and inducements to mobilize that? Okay. And so, budget time is always a time when you have to make decisions, so you have to prioritize. I recognize that. But in terms of where is there an opportunity to transform conflict into cooperation, it's not always when things on the level seem stable, in my view. It sometimes is, and in fact, that partnership with the UN, I'm sorry I keep mentioning it, but one of the things that, if you look at what Martin said when he was leaving office in his closing statement, he made a very strong case that this term humanitarian diplomacy was both a symptom and a potential contribution to an underlying problem, or solution to an underlying problem, which is the failure of political processes. So now we have to rely on humanitarian actors to be negotiating access, and when they're negotiating access, suddenly they realize that there are maybe some al-Shabaab fighters who are willing to put down their weapons if they knew they wouldn't be tortured. Or they have a conversation with the Taliban that opens up there might be a bigger political possibility there than people realized. And so I think we should be making the most of all of these levers. I think there should be a lot more investment in humanitarian diplomacy. I think we shouldn't necessarily assume that the best places to do this work is where war hasn't already broken out. But then I do understand decisions need to be made about where budgets go.
But Shamla, you raise a really good point. We have to look inside ourselves, as I tell my kids a lot of time, and reflect on their behavior. We, as a community, didn't collectively say anything. Yeah. When it came to Israel, Palestine. We were all very quiet, especially here in the United States. And that's something we need to look inside ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think if I would look at what are the missions and the habits of organizations in the peacebuilding sector. What is the theory of change that they have? Which are organizations that are committed to policy advocacy and making clear statements about what should and shouldn't happen? What are the organizations that are committed to building multi-partial teams on the ground and deferring everything to those teams, including what headquarters should or shouldn't say? Not saying something if you're the first organization is very different from not saying something if you're the second organization.
But it's a conversation we need to have. Peter?
Yeah, maybe a few reflections on the runway question. I mean, the issue of scale is a relevant one, but it's also the issue of connections and making the connection between the national and the local level, and also forging a change at the international level. And I think that convergence and bringing various spheres together is something that we also should strive for. And I think in what we hear from our members across the globe, and then maybe zooming in on the coastal West Africa region, because that was mentioned as an example, where also with the Global Fragility Act there was, and there is still, I think, an opportunity for potential innovative and partnership approach work. But we need to also look at the national and local level for investment and building an ecosystem for early warning, early action. I think that is where peace building at the local level needs to be relating itself to, and also needs to be investing much more with resources, but also with capacity strengthening for actually also being able to respond to challenges as they emerge. What we see happening at the same time in terms of making the connection with the international level, that the political will at the international level to invest in these kind of peacebuilding and local conflict prevention activities, it's not always there. And that is another line of activities and action that needs support, is trying to have this continuous dialogue with representatives of donors and foundations who actually continuously invest and strengthen their investment, but also invest for the long term, because this change will not happen overnight. It will not happen overnight that the situation in West Africa and the challenges that the region is confronted with will change by bringing in a Global Fragility Act. I mean, you need more actors, you need more actors that are willing to take up that challenge and also make the connection with the national and local level to be able to fix that ecosystem and make change happen there.
Okay, so I know we're at time. I know there's a bunch more questions. Feel free to ask them during the break. What I'm hearing a lot of is this collective action, and we've already called on many of you. We're going to be calling many more of you so we can work collectively. The nuance, the issue around being pragmatic, and how do we really focus in on the practical and actionable way that we get these prevention promises implemented. And it's a hard slog. We're going to hear more about it with the Global Fragility Act later today, and also with the UN. We have, some important meetings coming up as well. So we'll be talking about that later on. But now, have a wonderful break and have some great sessions that are coming up. So thank you so much.